Lionel, I want to start by asking you about the new world we all live in, specifically about the lockdown. And you have talked about the supine capitulation to a police state that has happened in the UK over the past few weeks. Do you think it's that bad? Do you think it's not only so bad that we have a police state, but it's even worse because everyone has capitulated to it in a rather craven fashion?
I think it's pretty depressing. I've come across in more than one article a reference to how free-thinking and independently minded we think of the British people. And I don't think that this situation bears that out. I think there's been research into especially the English attitude to authority, and the English in particular, they capitulate to authority. They obey the law for the law's sake. And this runs completely counter to my own inclinations, because I'm afraid I have a very deep set fuck you impulse. And I don't like being told what to do. And most of all, I want people to justify when they tell me what to do. I don't do things just because that's the law. I do them because it's the smart and right thing to do. And there hasn't been enough questioning on the public part, especially as to whether or not these lockdowns are even epidemiologically sensible. We're dealing with an international hysteria. You hear that word unprecedented all the time. There's nothing unprecedented about the virus itself. It's very much like lots of other viruses and lots of other illnesses. And in fact, it's less deadly than many other illnesses that we've had to learn to live with, some of which we have cured. What's unprecedented is our reaction to the lockdown. And it's the reaction that is causing the inevitable economic depression / forthcoming collapse. All right, that's the level of economic failure we are dealing with. But it's as if the disease has caused the collapse, right? All that economic fallout is just the inevitable fallout of this terrible illness. It has nothing to do with the illness. It has everything to do with our reaction to it. And we've never done this before. We've never said, oh my God, there's the contagious disease, which, we've been dealing with contagion since we have been walking upright. So we have to close down whole countries, and we have to close them down and not let anyone go anywhere or do anything or produce anything until the disease isn't here anymore. And with these kinds of contagious diseases, you can't just wait. I mean, if you're going to wait for it not to ever be there anymore, then you're going to wait forever. And of course, the other thing that's happened is that the people have been so successfully brainwashed that it's getting very difficult to unbrainwash them. So it's going to be difficult to get people to go back to work. And also, it's one thing to open restaurants again. It's another thing to convince people that they want to go out to eat. And furthermore, these rubbish laws are going to look as if they're going to be virtually indefinite. And many of these laws are going to make it impossible to run a successful business, a profitable business, even if the business is allowed to open. And if you think about it, if you have a restaurant and everyone has to be 2 meters apart, then how do you serve enough people to pay your staff and pay your chefs and pay your food bill and most of all pay your rent? I mean, a lot of businesses are the whole model is not going to stack up. That also includes various forms of production, factories or, cutting up meat. You can't spread people out too much. The facilities don't allow for it. And therefore it cuts your productivity so much that you can't make any money. And everyone is just dealing with all of these measures as if they're inevitable and it's just too bad and it's the fault of the virus. No, it isn't. It's the fault of rabid overreaction to the virus.
Yeah. Do you think there's an element where there are some sections of society who are rather enjoying the lockdown because they can carry on working from home. The Deliveroo guys will still bring them their food. They live in nice houses, and their blindness to the consequences of what they're doing or what they're supporting is driven by their distance from people who have to work, have to mix together, and have to make a living.
Oh, I do think there's a segment of the population that's having a wonderful time, especially people who are being paid 80% of their salaries. And yeah, I think for some people, this has turned into a kind of indefinite holiday. You don't have to work very hard. You don't have to get dressed for work. You can stay in your pajamas. You can sit in front of the computer and feel self-righteous about it. Right now, being incredibly lazy and unproductive is patriotic. And I think that this sector is going to be hard to move on to going back to normal, especially now that we're constantly informed that we can't go back to normal. There's going to be a so-called new normal, one of those expressions that we all now have learned to hate.
I find this to be one of the most chilling phrases of the modern era, and it raises a number of questions in my mind. The first one it raises is, who decides what the new normal is? And already it's been taken for granted that the new normal will be, a semi-permanent form of social distancing, staggered school days, less flying. Environmentalists in particular are excited about the new normal and the possibility that it will involve less human production and behavior and travel and so on. What strikes you as particularly problematic about the idea of a new normal? And in your mind, shouldn't we be asking the question of who gets to define what is the new normal and whether there is going to be any kind of genuine, open public debate about that?
Well, the biggest thing that has happened is not that some of us have got sick, but that we have transferred a fantastic amount of power to the state. We have transferred the power to the state to tell us when we can leave our own house. Now, that's incredible. The thing is that when you give power away, it's really hard to get it back again. Therefore, this new normal is all about saying, well, sorry, you gave us the power to tell us what you can buy in the shops and when you can go places and whether we're going to educate your children. It used to be an obligation. So we're going to keep that power. We have even told you whether or not you can see your friends. And if you do see your friends, then you have to stay 6.5 feet apart. The new normal was all about you gave it up. You're not getting it back. And there must be some satisfaction on a bureaucratic level in bossing people around on this level. There has to be. Or there would be more people who are saying, can we look at this again? Does this make any sense? I think particularly these public health people are crazed with power. I really, this is their moment in the sun. It's usually kind of a small part of government, that public health England, well, it's in the past, it's been spectacularly failed and it has been very petty, and it loves coming up with bossy little regulations, things they want to bring in for your own good, taxing sugar and you thinking about having fat taxes and that kind of thing. So they're already like that, but they've never had free reign to do whatever they want. And now they're really calling the shots. This whole business of ratting people out and for the good of all, supposedly. It has to do with that kind of prying, officious, judgmental relationship to your neighbor that you often see in terms of one's literal neighbor, the next door neighbor, the other people on your street, the kind of prim tutting. So now you can be a busybody and a fuss budget and be sanctimonious about it. This tendency, this police state thing, there's always a measure of the force that is just itching to be the big man on the block and ruin everyone's fun. I mean, I've really noticed lately that one of the things they're out for is anyone who seems to be having a good time.
Hmm.
And if you look at any number of things that have become a terrible thing to do, it makes absolutely no epidemiological difference. I mean, for example, sunbathing with nobody around you within 100 feet, and it has already been documented that, your chances of infection out of doors are very close to zero anyway. Swimming in the ocean, for pity's sake. Even if there's nobody else in sight. I can't think of anywhere where you're less likely to get infected with anything.
Yeah. No, it is shocking, deeply shocking and deeply disturbing. But at the same time, what surely is being revealed by this, as has been revealed in other situations in the recent past, is that science is not some fixed font of wisdom that can tell us exactly what we should do, but it is a kind of an ongoing, falsifiable, changeable search for the truth. So to what extent do you think we should be worried about living in a society that is justified in terms of the science?
They're not being scientific. These decisions are not being data-driven. They were made before any reliable data was really available. And also, decisions are not being reviewed and reviewed again and reviewed again in the way they should be if we were being guided by science rather than the science. I'm convinced that now that governments worldwide have committed to this lockdown strategy, despite the fact that we have never responded to any disease in the history of the universe in this fashion, they are not re-examining it in a scientific manner. The results are not being assessed in a scientific way because now we're committed to lockdowns, and that means that one of the things we're committed to is that they were the right thing to do. And that means it's going to continue to be the right thing to do.
Once you unleash the politics of fear and marshal people to a fearful, atomized cause, it's quite difficult then to just put a stop to that. And that suggests that part of the new normal will be the continuation of some of these problematic trends, I think.
It's not only politicians who are now invested in the lockdown.
Yeah.
It's also the people. Because after all, the people have made all these sacrifices. The people have gone through all these lockdowns. They've been obeying, in the main, all of these petty rules. Everyone hasn't enjoyed it. Nobody wants to think that these sacrifices were pointless, right? You want to feel that you're part of a larger upheaval in your nation and even in the world, and you did your part. You supported the forces of virtue, and whatever the fallout, it's too bad, but at least, the nation came together and addressed its foe, just like in World War II. There's been a lot of World War II rhetoric around. So no one wants to look back on that and say, oh, that was stupid, right? It's diminishing, and it's a little embarrassing. I did a radio interview about 10 days ago, and I was let go, actually, but I heard the caller after me complaining that lady described the UK populace as brainwashed, and he thought that was insulting. Well, it is insulting. It is insulting to be vulnerable to being brainwashed, and nobody wants to regard themselves that way. It's not flattering. So it's much, much nicer to just go with the government's line that this was a necessity and it's too bad, and this was just protecting the British people. And therefore, there's going to be a real battle after the virus has more or less subsided. There's going to be a battle still over whether or not the lockdowns were justified. And there's going to be an almost universal investment in their having been justified. And also the bigger danger, rather than just, the delusion that we're encouraging, a kind of historical delusion, but there's a huge danger of installing this as now what we do when we have a new infection coming along. In the short and medium term, we now have this knee-jerk assumption that if there is a rise of COVID fatalities or infection rates, even however gentle, what do? We lock down again. We do what we never used to do, and then we just do it as a matter of course. And, you've had some people, even like Nicholas Sturgeon, talking about how, well, we may have to, constantly impose lockdowns one after another, let them up and go try to run a business like that, right? Good luck to you. That's a politician talking, not someone who's ever run business.
Yeah.
So, but we just assume that. And I notice it again in the media when some politician refers to the inevitability of imposing the lockdown again, should the case rate rise, the newscasters don't say anything. They don't say, well, why do we just assume that we're going to do that again? Right? Isn't it going to prove incredibly destructive? Why don't we come up with a different way of approaching it? And then in the long term, now we've got this incredibly self-destructive response to contagion. Is this what we do now? Is this what we do all over the world? That we just shut off the economy? Because there are going to be more contagions. It's just a fact of life.
You can see that it would become even more the case that there would be no incentive whatsoever to have a genuine reckoning with it, because it would have to be held on to as the justifiable thing, because so many political, media, and intellectual forces have invested their energies into it as the good, decent, galvanizing thing to do. So that's a point really worth making, because it's worth prepping ourselves for a pretty difficult intellectual battle ahead, I think.
I think it's very interesting if you look at the way what's going on in Sweden has been covered over here and how people react to it. There's a huge desire, it's palpable, for Sweden to fail. Everyone wants Sweden to melt into the bowels of the earth with disease, and they're going to be punished, because they haven't done what everyone else is doing, and they don't get the message, and they'll be sorry. And any suggestion that Swedish death rates are higher than other people's is reported with great relish. And one of the things that you need to keep an eye on is the reliability with which Swedish deaths are always reported in the context of other Scandinavian countries. Because if you put Swedish deaths in the context of everybody else, they're just in the middle, right? In terms of deaths per 100,000. So it's a rigging of the conversation. It's a rigging of statistics to make the Swedes look as bad as possible. And again, this is about being invested in the lockdown strategy. So everyone wants the lockdowns to be worthwhile. It's kind of it's understandable if they've happened already. No one wants to think that you have done this horrible thing to your country for no reason. So if Sweden gets away with it, everybody's going to be furious. And there is going to be a lot of effort made to make it look as if Sweden was different from us, or, there was some element there that explained why they didn't have to lock down. And there's going to be a big effort to make it look as if it was somehow a catastrophe. I think one of the things that distresses me about this whole social distancing phenomenon, it's another phrase that I've come to detest, is that it encourages a tendency that was there before, and that may not be expressly to do with the broad present, but is a direction we can always go psychologically in relation to other people in general. And that is, we need each other to survive. We are now being coached to regard anyone else, including our friends, right? Even the people we know, much less strangers, as sources of lethal contagion. People are to be avoided. Socializing has become a form of evil. And even this whole experience of queuing up at a supermarket and staying 2 meters apart from everyone, I find it really upsetting. It's such an ugly way to relate to people. And I have noticed in those queues, people don't talk to each other. And that's shocking. Here you are involved in this communal weird thing, right? And usually when there's some communal weird thing, the barriers between strangers are broken down. I mean, I was in New York after 9/11, and one of the only nice things about that experience was people talk to each other. Strangers talk to each other. Strangers smile to each other on the street. People at checkout talk to the men and women at the till. It was nice. It was warm. It felt like being in a place that others were sharing with each other rather than being somewhere where everyone was sort of putting up with each other. It was touching. And this is the absolute opposite of that. This is suddenly, even ordinary interchanges, I spend a lot of time alone. I actually find going out and buying something of a relief, because however nominally I get to interact with somebody. And now even those small interactions are very cold.
Yeah.
It's not just the masks and the gloves. People don't smile at each other. They're very wary and often just actively hostile.
Yeah.
And it's a horrible, horrible world to be living in. And it just gives me the willies that we're now being told, well, that may be the world for the indefinite future.
Yeah.
We're now going to force you to think of all other human beings as the enemy. That you are to be hostile to them. You are to avoid touching them. You must not come near them. And, that does translate emotionally. It isn't just you avoid them physically. It becomes an attitude. We are being educated to be misanthropes. And we need each other. And we can't keep living like this. And we can't give over to government the right to tell us we have to keep living like this. And I'm horrified that we have abdicated the right to, free association to the government.
But do you think there's an element of fear? There's an element of not wanting to be seen to buck the trend? Or is it more sinister than that? Have significant sections of the intellectual classes bought into the notion that social life and economic life must be entirely frozen in response to a new virus?
Well, history is full of whole populations getting with the program. That's what they do. They become convinced that it is in their self-interest not to buck the system. Some of that is fear. And then there's something else going on, which is beyond fear. It is a natural herd instinct that some people have and some people don't. And I can tell you right now, I don't have it. I never have it. And that's why I constantly get myself into so much trouble. So this herd instinct is very strong. And you see whole countries just go off the edge of a cliff and nobody stops it. I mean, I realize references to World War II are terribly trying. But, look at what happened with Nazi Germany. It wasn't just that everyone was afraid. Some of them were afraid, and some of them capitulated to the way you were supposed to be now because they were worried what would happen to them if they didn't. So there's an element of that. But there clearly was another larger element of people just saying, I guess that's the way we're supposed to be now. They don't have whatever it takes, to look at something twice and say, well, I'm being told to do that, or this is the new normal, if you will. But does it have to be? Do I approve of it? Does it make sense? Is it moral? Is it best for the society as a whole? Maybe I don't think this is a good idea. Mm-hmm. It takes a certain kind of person. And I'm afraid there's something about the better part of the human race that doesn't have the instinct to question doing what the rest of the herd is doing. It just doesn't have it. Mm-hmm. And it's depressing.